So what regulations are there on compensation? Well, recently the Securities and Exchange Commission has aggressively been going after these for-profit institutions. Also, Congress has put a tremendous level of scrutiny on these for-profit institutions. Roughly a month ago, the Supreme Court of the United States denied writ of certiorari on the Apollo Group against some investors for a $227 million jury verdict for a class action lawsuit against the Apollo Group for keeping information about violations with the Department of Education from investors. This is not the first run-in for-profit institutions have had, nor will it be the last. Roughly 5 or 6 years ago, the Apollo Group settled a $70 million lawsuit on an incentive plan for admissions officers that were commissioning these officers based on the number of students they enrolled. This essentially led to the admissions officers being salespeople and having a perverse incentive to entice these students to attend these for-profit institutions. Because these for-profit companies are not nonprofits and they're not public entities, there is not as much regulation on executive compensation as many in the public would like. Nonprofits, which are private institutions, traditionally are required to provide reasonable compensation to their executives and also to consider the salaries and compensations of similar sized groups. There is no such check on this for for-profit institutions. There are weak regulations on the amount of revenue these companies can take on from the federal government. In essence, what's called the 90-10 rule, requiring at least 10% of revenue to come from outside, directly from the federal government, of which expenditure includes student loans. While most for-profit institutions do not come too close to broaching this 90-10 threshold, the University of Phoenix frequently approaches it, as upwards of 85% of the revenue comes directly from the federal government through loans or grants such as federal funds from the higher education of former military personnel. So what solutions are there? Similar to the housing bubble bursting and thus making it more difficult to receive loans on houses for individuals who were typically given mortgages in the past decade. Improving regulations on granting federal loans to students could help stave off the growing outstanding student loan debt. However, this would go contrary to a major policy of the Obama administration in providing higher education to as many Americans as possible. This would make it much more difficult for people of low means and poorer backgrounds to earn a higher education. Forgiving outstanding federal student loan debt would only encourage the for-profit institutions to continue the behavior that they've been embarking on. However, increasing the scrutiny by the government will continue to help control the for-profit institutions from taking advantage of students by them taking out very great amounts of federal loans. The more regulation on for-profit education would only decrease the compensation for executives, especially the equity compensation, which creates the most perverse incentive of the compensations that these executives receive. Furthermore, more regulation on admissions policies and the potential defrauding of investors on the default rate of loans will continue to help properly incentivize the decision-making process in for-profit institutions. Increasing the scrutiny on review boards and accreditation services will also prevent what is currently happening with the University of Phoenix and the Apollo Group, where individuals who run review boards and accreditation services sit on the board of directors for the for-profit institutions. Increasing the transparency would only shed more light on the large amounts executives are compensated and the large percentage of revenue that goes to executive compensation. Requiring more revenue spent on tuition and instruction would ensure a higher product of education at for-profits to match the high cost of tuition. Better incentivizing future term-based compensation, such as tying equity to graduation rate or student debt level, or as recently proposed but not enacted in legislation, tying compensation and tying the awarding of federal student loans to employment following graduation. These would only help better align the for-profit institutions' interests with those of their students. That essentially is where the issues have boiled down to with this, and that the for-profit institutions have very distinctly different interests than those that are best for their students. Whereas at traditional universities, there is the interests are much more aligned. With more attention being paid to the for-profit education industry and the executive compensation within it, the dangers of taking out enormous amounts of federal student debt to fund a low-quality education at a for-profit institution will continue to better incentivize these for-profit institutions to provide a better product to students at a more efficient operation cost, and could better align it in the future with the good qualities of traditional education, as well as maintaining the edge that for-profit institutions have in being able to more quickly adapt to changes in the demand for certain areas of education by potential students. Thank you.